Hello, I'm Doris Suchet. I'm the C-Suite Director with Winmark, a professional C-Suite membership organisation. And I'm pleased to be talking today to Peter Cheese, Chief Executive of the CIPD, the professional body for HR and people development professionals in the UK and worldwide. It was set up in 1913, and the CIPD is the world's oldest association in its field and has over 160,000 members internationally. It is an influential, independent voice campaigning for better work and working lives. Hi, Peter. Thank you for talking to me today. The CIPD has partnered with us, with Winmark, on our C-Suite 2024 and beyond report based on research with over 200 C-Suite executives. And I'm keen to get your perspective on some of the key themes emerging from the report, specifically innovation and agility and the role of AI.
Yeah.
So firstly, the report emphasised the critical need for strategic agility and innovation in 2024. So from your perspective, what can organisations do to cultivate an agile, experimental mindset, would you say?
Yeah, it's really important. And what's driven the need for agility is because we are living in a very fast changing context. And that's been going on for a number of years. But particularly now with the acceleration of things like technology and artificial intelligence, which we'll come on to, it really has, I think, provoked an even bigger recognition amongst businesses and business leaders of the need to be agile and responsive. And I'd say the first thing, of course, is that you've got to be able to look outwards. You've got to be able to scan the horizon, see what's coming at you as an organization, both from a perspective of opportunities, but also, of course, from a perspective of potential threats or risks to your business. So that's always the first part of agility. You have to be able to look out and you have to be able to sense the changes to react to. And then, of course, how do I react to them? And this idea of being more experimental, which you touched on, so the need for us to be perhaps in many contexts slightly less risk averse in the sense of experimenting, because we don't know all the answers and new things are happening, then of course one of the best ways to address that is to try things without saying, look, I'm going to spend a whole year and a half analysing it all and then we're going to have one big programme of change. To be able to move forwards perhaps a little bit more incrementally and learn as you go and adjust and adapt as you go. And those are very much the ideas of sort of agile development and indeed often are the real seeds of an innovation culture as well. So I think that idea of being able to, as I said, experiment and move forwards in smaller steps rather than thinking it's all got to be figured out before we make a move at all is very much part of the tenor of conversations I hear in many boardrooms and with leaders today. There are other parts to it then culturally. How do you create a culture that supports all of that?
Right.
And you've got to listen to all your people. I mean, when I start with that first idea of horizon scanning, everybody can play a role in that. That your people are out in the market talking to your customers, maybe working in your technology department or whatever. We can all play a part in that. So that's one part of the culture. We're all sharing ideas and feel that we can speak up too. Because many cultures in the past haven't always supported that idea. They've been much more, I'm the boss and I tell you what to do, what was often known as command and control. So there are cultural aspects to it as well, of course. And then finally, I would add in elements like upskilling and reskilling. I mean, if the world around us is changing very fast and we know that's going to impact roles and jobs and skills, then it becomes a strategic capability we have to build in organizations much more, is our ability to upskill and reskill our people to meet the changing needs and demands of the markets that we serve, the products and services we're creating, and to drive the business forwards.
So very much sort of having a culture allowing for the prototyping to happen.
Yes.
And you mentioned new approaches to reskilling, upskilling, and sort of prototyping these ideas essentially. What new approaches to professional development and continuous learning do you think need to be embraced by companies in 2024 and onwards?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is embracing that idea of continuous learning. One of the sad facts, looking at it particularly through a sort of UK lens, where we're both based at the moment, is that the reality is UK businesses have not invested enough in the skills of their workforce in the past. And if you look at international league tables, if you will. We don't fare well in all of that. And at the same time, we've not been investing enough in technology in the workplace either. So the net result of that is you tend to end up with quite a lot of lower skilled jobs, and you don't have the same focus on the idea of I've got to upskill and reskill as well. So the first thing I would say is that that has to become part of your strategic thinking. The idea that we've got to continuously learn in order to adapt, that we've got to upskill and reskill our people, and therefore continuous professional development is absolutely part of the ethos. But then to enable that in effective ways, because business, in particular at this point in time, resources are tight, and so many times in the past when times have been tight, learning it seemed to be, or training seemed to be one of those more discretionary activities. Maybe we could cut back on it now because it's an expense and come back to it a bit later on.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is we haven't always been good at articulating the value of the training that we're doing. So we need to sustain it. We need to be clear on the value that it creates. But then the other very, very important point about it is how we can, in many ways, reinvent training and learning in the workplace around some very important principles. One is to try to develop training and learning that is in the flow of work. In other words, it's not just that big exercise we're so familiar with in the past is, right, let's all go off and do a training program and hopefully some of that's going to stick and then we come back to our jobs. Increasingly, it's about this idea of in the flow of work. So I can access the learning and training at that point of need, and that training or learning, of course, particularly with the help of technology and artificial intelligence, can be delivered in ways that are almost seamless to my job, whether it's augmented reality or whatever it might be. And now with AI, we can see the opportunity to personalize that training much more so that it meets the individual needs better. That can include things like online coaching and mentoring, so coaching you through the learning process as well. And these are radical shifts in how we think about the more traditional models of training and learning in the past. And we have to embrace that, not only because it's a more efficient way to deliver training and learning and can be less disruptive to time off to go and train people, which so often has been one of the barriers, but also it's more effective. And we really do know that now, that whilst the early generations of e-learning and digital learning were not terribly effective because we tended to replicate what we were doing in the classroom and just make it electronic.
That's right.
Now we can really see very different ways of doing that and make, therefore, learning literally part of the fabric of how we all work. And I think that's really exciting.
And sort of making it truly continuous as well.
Yes, absolutely.
For all people. You mentioned tech in the workplace, and that, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the sort of second top priority in the report. And the report identifies harnessing AI and emerging technologies ethically and responsibly as something that is also critical this year. So what do you think organizations need to be thinking about to prepare leaders to lead in an increasingly AI-driven workplace?
Yeah. I think it's a very important question because a thing we've been focused on a lot in particularly recent months. I mean, AI is not new, but my goodness, with the emergence of so-called generative AI tools like ChatGPT, the whole conversation has exploded. And one of the first things I'd say is every leader's got to lean into this subject. We can't avoid it. We can't say, well, let's wait until it evolves and everybody else has figured out, and then I'll come onto the journey with them. So the first thing is, I think, to raise awareness. So we need to make sure as leaders that we are sufficiently aware of a direction of travel around AI, that we are becoming more aware of how it can be used. And people talk a lot about use cases now. We're all, if go back to the first point about experimentation, where and how are people experimenting and what are they learning from it? And we need to find the mechanisms to educate ourselves effectively on things like that. So how can it be used? Where can it be used? What are the things I need to think about, which come back to stuff like experimentation as an approach? But also, what are the risks? And how do I ensure as a business leader that the ways in which we're using AI and technology are ethical and responsible? And that has lots of dimensions to it. And indeed, I very much believe that the profession that I represent through the CIPD, that people profession needs to be integral to that conversation. Because a lot of this is about, when we say ethical, well, a lot of it is about how's it going to affect people's jobs, that we make sure that people are not being left behind and we don't end up with a polarized workforce where, some people are all AI enabled and their jobs have all changed and they're doing wonderful things, but other people are just being left behind. So I also use this phrase of we've got to ensure a just transition for AI, much as we've talked about the idea of a just transition as we move away from fossil fuels to the green economy.
That's right.
So these are things which we need to make sure that we're supporting leaders in and framing. And therefore, one of the things we're working on as the CIPD is indeed, what would an ethical framework look like? What are the questions I should be asking as a leader, and the reassurances I should be seeking that we are going to be using this ethically and responsibly? But there's no doubt, and I think in most business leaders' minds and in many people's minds, that people see AI and particularly these generative AI tools as a real opportunity to improve effectiveness and efficiency. In other words, productivity, because we know that one of the real challenges we've had in many businesses and indeed across the economy is productivity. And I think if we harness AI and technology effectively and invest it in the right ways, absolutely it should be able to improve productivity. But more than that, and this is what I get excited about in many ways, is I think it can help us transform jobs as well. I mean, I've already mentioned the point about let's make sure we are creating job opportunities for people and not leaving people behind. But in creating those new jobs and roles, that we are focused on outcomes such as what is a good quality job, and a job that uses my skills effectively, where AI perhaps can remove some of the more administrative or boring parts of what I do.
Mundane parts,
yeah,
yes.
and really allow me as a person to focus on the things that I get the most enjoyment from, but also that deliver the best outcome through the task and role that I'm performing. And I think that is in many ways the future we should be looking towards. And that, again, re-emphasizes the point about having the people profession in the room who should be there to help to design the jobs in ways that do produce those kinds of outcomes, which also, incidentally, yes, are good for your well-being and maybe reduce stress, because we know a sad fact of modern working life is stress levels have been climbing. That has impact on things like mental health. So those are very much, I think, the positive outcomes, but they won't happen by accident, and we have to design and think our way through those questions to ensure that that is where we are ending up. And those become part of a framework of principles as well. But that should be our goal. And I think if we can achieve those things, then we can create better work for people with better outcomes for the organizations as well, more balance in our work and working lives, and all the things that we've been striving for many years, but have seemed to be a little bit beyond our grasp over the last 20 years when we've really been focusing on these questions much more strongly.
That's true. That's true. Well, thank you for covering the sort of the question I sort of had for you was one of the things I wanted to find out more is, what role should professional bodies play in setting standards, if you like, in providing guidance in setting the play, if you like, for use of AI. So it's great to sort of, in my head, what I heard is sort of, leading the leaders so they can lead.
No, I think so, Doris. And obviously, I have a very strong belief in the role of the people profession, but I think through all professional functions, we all have a role to play. Yeah, in to some extent ensuring that these things are being used responsibly, because you can go back to what it means to be a professional, what it means acting ethically and responsibly. So let's bring that thinking into this space, which after all does need to be seen very holistically and collectively, that we're all contributing to the idea of how we use these, what are very significant changes, which many people talk about. This is a real inflection point in technology. Let's all make sure we are working towards that idea of ethical and responsible use, which is driving positive outcomes for all.
And I think that's what gets everyone on board, if you're one of those organizations that can truly say, not just say, but actually act and support with company behaviors that belief that we're going to do this ethically and responsibly. I think that can only get people behind you and behind the idea. Very much so.
And to reassure people, because we know, you look at any number of surveys, and ask people what they think about AI. And there's as much fear out there as there is opportunities, particularly from employees, where they're saying, gosh, is this going to displace my job? And what's it really going to mean? And, will my skills be redundant? Will my organization support me? All those sorts of questions. And, because I honestly do think the truth is, and however you express it, that AI and technology will impact every job. It's not just a question of some jobs. It'll affect every job.
No, it'll affect us, yeah.
And there's a great line that I've heard a number of times now where people say things like, well, the biggest risk that you might have to you personally in a job is not necessarily that the job gets displaced, but you get displaced by somebody who is using AI. In other words, we've got to also lean into it individually, and hence the experimentation idea, which is to pick up tools like ChatGPT and just experiment with it, even in our sort of non-work lives, and just learn the kinds of things that it can do, and then begin to work within your role and your team and your organization. Say, supposing we tried this in my role or my colleague's role, and learn together. And I think that's, again, very much plays to that idea of experimentation and agile culture.
Yeah, and sort of experimenting, and I can actually, I think what is interesting about AI and sort of almost the fear you mentioned about it, it can actually aid your creativity,
Sure.
your prototyping, if you embrace it, if you play with it, if you actually, yes, if you lean in and embrace. Yes. And it's interesting and reassuring to hear you say what I don't feel I hear enough. Even I hear more fear than actually what you said, that it could also, yes, it could take away some jobs, but it could also create new jobs and opportunities. And I think that that still isn't being said enough about the opportunities around AI.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we do need to think about it in those ways. The opportunities it creates to create better jobs, not just displace jobs, but to create better jobs. And as I said, I think it can enhance our own productivity and outcomes and creativity, which is ultimately good for all of us. And in the end, I think the other thing that's clearly seems to be emerging, and I believe for a long time actually, is that the more technology advances, the more it emphasizes our human skills. The idea of things like my ability to be creative and to innovate. Now, technology can support some of that process, but it's still a very innate human thing to be able to think creatively, think outside the box, think what if, and experiment. It's also very much emphasizing the idea of critical thinking, which again, I think is a very human thing, exercising judgment, because not everything you read is true, right? Whether it's come from the fanciest generative AI tool or not. And we need to be able to continue to apply critical thinking and judgment to all of it. The other innate skills of our ability to collaborate, to communicate, all those sorts of things. But with technology, which is now becoming so more accessible, and so again, people talking about AI and the way we interface with technology as being as significant as any other part of the shift. In other words, rather than having to teach humans to speak machines are now learning how to speak human. And we're able to interact with technology without having to know how to code or whatever. And that's a big shift forwards. And therefore, people have talked about the democratization of technology, just to emphasize a couple of the points I've already made, means that we can all access it. It's not something that's just, as I said, I've got to be a coder or something like that to be able to access technology. We can all access it.
And I think an interesting point you mentioned there about, the communication lines, it's not just tech talking to humans or humans to tech. I've recently been to a Winmark meeting with general counsel, with CLOs, and what was interesting for me to hear is that actually very soon in the future will be machines talking to machines. You can't not use AI, because there will be texts written in AI that will only communicate well with other texts written in AI, and so.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I read a story. I mean, sometimes you have to be careful what you read, as I said, but it was it was somebody claiming that for the first time they'd had two computers or AI bots conclude and negotiate on a contract together.
Wow.
a legal contract. So obviously the bots have been given certain
That's
parameters,
right.
and then they went away and did it. Yeah, I mean, to me, again, this is another very important part about technology, that when we talk about ethical standards, one of the things that we've got to be very clear on is that we understand what it's doing. A lot of the principles that are all being written, and indeed appearing more through legislation, is that we've got to, these technologies got to be transparent. We've got to have some understanding what they're doing and why they reached the conclusions they did, and then being able to apply our judgment to it. And that question of accountability that goes with it. If we let this stuff run amok and think, oh, it can decide for us, then I think we start to get into dangerous territory. So the importance of human oversight, the importance of transparency, the importance of accountability in all of these tools that we're developing are really, really important principles.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. I also have a question about how this can all work in this new hybrid world. I'm sure that it's going to be something that will keep coming up and being asked sort of for a while still. So AI and tech, as you've already said, requires reskilling, upskilling, constant, continuous learning. So with the growth, and it's going, it's here, it's going to stay. It's not going anywhere, of remote and hybrid working. How does professional development need to adapt to provide collaborative learning in distributed environments, essentially?
Yes, and it's an important point. I mean, first of all, yes, I'm both a believer and an advocate of these different forms of working, more flexible working. But the reality still is that we're still learning, and we've gone through a very big shift, which was absolutely accelerated by the pandemic. And we're still learning. What are the best ways to keep connection and cultural integration, and what happens with new joiners, and all these sorts of questions. And there is no one size fits all, and we need to keep driving forward our learning. But I do very much believe that flexible working in all its forms, not just where I can work, but when I work and hours of work and so forth, are very, very important parts of the future of work, which have many benefits, not least inclusion, because many people are not able to fully work from an office 9 to 5 or whatever it might be. So it's a very important part of inclusion. But it does, as you said, raise other questions like, so how do I ensure collaboration and connection? And if I'm trying to create collaborative learning. Now, again, technology's advanced a lot in the ability to support all of that. And so whether it's avatar type connections where people can literally feel like they're connecting in a virtual world in an almost human form, or whether it's just the ability to have coaching and online coaching, which is adapted to your need, but also can bring in others and create those sort of shared learning experiences. There's an awful lot that I think is evolving very quickly in the learning sphere to acknowledge that that's also something that technology needs to be able to enable us to do, even if, as you said, we're working remotely or not physically in the same space. How can it feel like that or replicate that? And of course, then you've got all these sort of metaverse ideas that we should take that sort of construct even further. But I think this is part of again the great advances in technology and how it's sort of been allowing us to interact with it in increasingly human ways. And I think this is an aspect of it.
Indeed. Peter, thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights on these critical points. Before we wrap up, are there any final thoughts or advice you would like to share?
Yeah, I think we've got to show some courage. These are difficult times, and as the report clearly called out, I mean, there are things going on in all sorts of areas, technology and geopolitical change, economic uncertainty, social change. Then they're all happening at once, and so it's a very challenging time, I think, for businesses and business leaders. There's an awful lot to think about and take on board. But as I said, I think we've got to be prepared to take some risks. So we've got to be opening up our minds. We've got to be horizon scanning. And then, I think the final thing I would add to that is that this point about collaboration, that we really do work together, both within our organizations, but also between organizations. And we share more and see ourselves as part of communities that are helping to drive positive change, perhaps a bit more collectively. And all of that is linked to the idea of empowerment, and we know not only is empowerment important if you're going to create these more agile ways of working, but empowerment is vital also to the idea of innovation, because you bring all the ideas together from wherever they may come from, because no leader can, I think, ever kind of claim, but certainly not now, that they've got all the answers. So you unlock, if you like, that sort of all the different experiences and the diversity you have across your organization. And the final point is that all the research on engagement that's happened and been summarized in various ways points to the idea of having a voice and a degree of autonomy about what you do is absolutely critical to the idea of engagement, and therefore giving of my best. You know, people want to feel that they're being trusted to be part of the innovative process or creative process, or come up with ideas,
being
and help to
heard.
drive positive change. And so you know, you add all of those things up and you say, yeah, so let's try to not be, you know, you've got to set guidelines. It's not a free for all. But to therefore then within those parameters and guidelines, really encourage these ideas of empowerment and collective and collaborative working to help us shape a future. And it is about shaping that future, and that we all have a voice in that, an agency in it. And I think, aside from anything else, that is a very engaging idea for people.
It is indeed. Freedom within the framework, sort of.
Yes.
Is the image I'm happy. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you all for watching. If you wanted to find out more about the findings of the report, or indeed the good work that CIPD and Winmark do, you can visit our websites at cipd.org and winmarkglobal.com. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Doris.